The Silent Hill name is both one of the most beloved and disappointing franchises in gaming. What was once the standard bearer for horror and the biggest rival to Resident Evil's survival horror throne, Silent Hill has since been reduced to nothing but fond memories from past consoles and a seemingly never-ending supply of false rumors around a post-PT reboot. The first Silent Hill was released in early 1999 for the PlayStation 1, and it was unlike anything players had encountered before. We'd already seen plenty of over-the-top gore and scary stuff from titles like Doom, Resident Evil, Nightmare Creatures, Parasite Eve, Clock Tower, and so on, but something about Silent Hill stood out as different. The tension, atmosphere, and an extremely dark storyline was a brand new experience for gamers. The first installment's plot was kicked off with cult activity, drug use, and summoning a literal demon by the means of burning and torturing a child, who was chosen as the host of said cult's god. This was in 1999. Back then, this was pretty fucking ridiculous for a video game. Outside of the JRPG genre and outlier titles like Metal Gear Solid, video games were really just starting to scratch the surface of what was possible as far as in-depth storytelling and world building. Whereas the majority of horror games at the time put the scares right in front of you to react to or used fixed camera angles to help induce stress, Silent Hill tried to make you fear what you couldn't see. Without using pre-rendered backgrounds, Team Silent, the name given to the creators of the game, chose to use lighting and fog effects to limit draw distance and load times. What started as a necessary evil in order to make the game, the fog and pocket flashlight have become a staple of the franchise and helped build the lore of the town. Due to the poor in-game visibility, the radio was also created as a way to warn players of danger, but again, not knowing which angle or how far it was coming from. It was a genius way of raising tension and keeping players on edge even when nothing was around. One of the few things that gave this game a lot of charm was the main protagonist, Harry Mason. There was nothing special about him. He wasn't a trained fighter, a cop, ex-military, some kind of special forces, nothing. His in-game dialogue is even pretty boring too. He was just a guy that got caught in the middle of the cult's activities and wanted his adopted daughter back. This also led to Harry's aim and gun control being somewhat unreliable. Whether it was an intentional flaw due to Harry's lack of experience or a cover for the gameplay mechanics being unpolished, it gave players even more reason to fear what they were encountering. Silent Hill went on to become one of the most recognizable and acclaimed games on the PlayStation 1. Think about the other major PS1 franchises though. Final Fantasy, Tekken, Metal Gear, Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, Gran Turismo, Twisted Metal. These all had multiple games in their libraries, most of which were pumped out at a significantly more rapid pace than today's standards. We're talking about a new game every year and a half or so. Silent Hill managed to be a classic on that system as a brand new franchise and without the benefit of multiple titles. Needless to say, when the PlayStation 2 was released, fans expected a new Silent Hill game, and they expected it fast. Silent Hill 2 was released in November of 2001, and to this day is still considered one of the best sequels and best horror games ever made, if not the single best. Nothing is ever completely unanimous, and everyone's taste is different, but this was essentially a two-horse race at the time. It was either Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil 2. In the years since, we've seen titles like the Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 7, Dead Space, Amnesia, Outlast, Alien Isolation, and even the PT demo get a lot of love in the best horror game category. A lot of people still have a soft spot for Silent Hill 2, myself included. While I was playing through The Last of Us 2 and making my video for that, check that out too if you've got an hour and a half to kill and give a shit about that game, one thing I kept seeing online and in reviews was how the game was too miserable and didn't make players happy. As strange as it sounds, not all games go for that end goal, and every time I heard that complaint, I always thought, have people forgotten about Silent Hill 2? I vividly remember playing this all the time with my friends and the reactions we had to it. It's always had a place on my personal favorite games list. Then it occurred to me, I haven't played this game in like 18 fucking years. So let's potentially ruin some nostalgic memories and take a deep dive back into Silent Hill 2 and see just how good it still is. Real quick, two things to get out of the way first. This is obviously your spoiler warning for a pretty old game, but it is a very story-driven game nonetheless. If for some reason you stumbled across this video and aren't familiar with the plot of Silent Hill 2 and want to experience it yourself, go play it first. It could cost you though. An actual used PS2 copy will usually run you close to $100 give or take. What I'm capturing gameplay with cost me $79.99 because of course I couldn't find my old copy. It's so expensive because all the other ports are noticeably worse than the original PS2 version. The 2012 HD collection doesn't even have the same voice actors, and despite being 11 years newer, actually sounds worse. The game looks more polished and less blurry, but the fog also looks more like an emulator glitch rather than something that's a key gameplay mechanic. It's weird to describe, but it's pretty much universally recognized as a bad port. If you've got a couple extra bucks to spend, try to get a legit PS2 copy. There is a PC port, but it isn't on Steam, and you'll have to trust mod site downloads and shit like that where half the comments say it's great and half say it doesn't work. Secondly, because I brought it up earlier, if you're someone who got upset about things like killing a dog in The Last of Us 2 or thought that game was too sad to play, Silent Hill 2 is not a game you're going to enjoy or, more importantly, appreciate. That might sound like I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not trying to be. This is a sincere heads up. Silent Hill 2 deals with some very sensitive subjects ranging from sexual abuse and suicide to bullying and murder, not to mention all the PTSD that goes along with the territory. The dated graphics and production values don't make these themes as in-your-face or as blunt as the current generational standards can, however, they are still very present in the story. In my opinion, it's a fantastic and thought-provoking story, but certainly not something I would overly recommend as a traditional fun experience. These are not cartoony or over-the-top characters depicting these themes either. The characters in Silent Hill 2 have tragic, real-world problems in their backstories that eventually lead them into the supernatural setting of the game. It's definitely not for everyone. This is tailored directly at a horror fan demographic. So, if you want to tap out, there's your warning. With that out of the way, let's get into what made this game so memorable and if it still holds up to its reputation over the years. For part 2, where could Silent Hill go that was darker than a supernatural town bending to the thoughts of a scared, physically and mentally abused psychic child being confronted with hell demons and a cult? They went the only scarier place, real-life trauma and the emotions that follow. They took realistic, adult themes and mixed that into the already established supernatural lore of the town. They went headfirst into that town, making people confront and accept actual human emotions while they faced their own sins that brought them to Silent Hill in the first place. It became psychological horror at its best. The beginning of, say, Dead Space is tense and genuinely scary to play, but once I put the controller down, I'm not worried about a necromorph ripping me apart while I get up to go take a dump. With Silent Hill 2's horror, you might find yourself sitting around and wondering how you'd react to learning of a loved one coming down with terminal illness, how you'd feel about a friend killing themselves, or someone else. This was the type of horror that Silent Hill 2 aimed to achieve. We take the helm as James Sunderland, a man in his late 20s that got a letter from his dead wife to come to Silent Hill. He acknowledges that this is crazy and that a dead person can't write a letter, but he doesn't care. Even 3 years after her death, James still feels he has nothing left to lose or live for. This wasn't some sort of car accident or out-of-the-blue quick death that his wife Mary had either. They never say it specifically, but I always had the notion that she was diagnosed with some aggressive form of cancer. James had to watch as his wife, who was only in her mid-20s herself, slowly died while fighting an uphill battle. We get the whole spectrum of emotions that went along with this. They really paint this picture, and it's some heavy shit at times. The beginning of the game really reinforces just how beaten down and emotionally numb James currently is. In Silent Hill 1, Harry Mason's motivation to keep going deeper and deeper into the town was to save his daughter Cheryl. With James, they did the opposite. It's a last-ditch effort that he realizes is meaningless from the start, yet he goes through with it anyway, at times blatantly saying he doesn't care if it's dangerous. James's whole journey to Silent Hill also mirrors his own feelings of helplessness he faced while trying to support Mary through her struggle with inevitable death. Mentally, this guy has been in a bad place for a long time, and it shows. I appreciated this introduction to James a lot more now that I'm older. James acknowledges that his trip to Silent Hill is crazy, and that he hopes he hasn't gone crazy in the process as well. That he just has to see it through because he has nothing else really going for him. I can't help but compare it to the beginning of Resident Evil 7. Now, I love most things Resident Evil, and 7 is a great game. But Ethan is a fucking bore of a character. It's everything around him that's great, and he's kinda just along for the ride while providing a set of eyes for the player. So, Mia is supposedly dead for 3 years as well, and he gets a Zoom message or whatever the hell it was from her out of nowhere and just drives to Louisiana. He calls a friend, and the two have the most dull 20-second conversation about a recently made video featuring a person they thought to be dead for 3 long years. If James went to the police with a handwritten letter saying it's from his dead wife, again, he knows they'd just think he was crazy and not believe him. If Ethan went to the cops with a new video message from his wife that also gives them an area of where to look, well, that kind of changes the plot and the direction of the game. Resident Evil 7 is so good that you turn a blind eye to dumb plot conveniences like that, but Silent Hill 2 is a much more realistic style of storytelling, even though it's in a clearly fictional setting. Little things like making James be emotionally numb and not care about telling people he's looking for his dead wife just fits so well with the plot that's being presented here. You're never caught thinking to yourself, call the fucking cops, dude, or what are you doing? Just get the hell out of there. Cliché thoughts like those tend to plague a lot of the horror genre as a whole, but are almost completely absent from Silent Hill 2's storytelling. It seems realistic that someone in their 20s who already lost a significant other really could sleepwalk through life for 3 straight years and not get over it. For all the positives surrounding it, there are negatives which just can't be ignored. I'm still really bad at transitioning into the meat of these videos and getting to my main points, so let's just rip that band-aid off and get some of the bad things out of the way now. I want to start with the bad aspects because most of them don't really have anything to do with the plot of the game, which is its main selling point and strongest attribute. Not to mention that the bulk of this video is going to concentrate on the plot over the gameplay. Even when Silent Hill 2 was first released, gameplay and combat were criticized and seen as a weakness. In 2021, that hasn't changed a bit. Combat is as basic gets. You hold a button that lets you lock onto an enemy and then you shoot them or smack them with a stick. There's nothing really more in-depth about it. And a battle system that simple doesn't always have to be a bad thing. What makes it a bad thing here is the lack of variance. It gets boring. You will face the same enemies over and over again. Any enemy that is outside in the streets of the town is so easily avoidable that it almost begs the question, why are they even there in the first place? Inside the cramped corridors of indoor locations, James' running speed is far faster than the enemy's attack speed. As long as you keep moving, the only way you'll really get hit is by running directly into an enemy. Even then, you can still keep moving and come out unharmed at least half the time. If you aren't just running past them, they are also very easy to kill. Unless you get cornered by multiple enemies and don't have a gun handy, you'll be completely fine. Speaking of which, you get the handgun pretty early, and it's essentially like having an overpowered weapon all game. The basic handgun will drop most enemies in only 3 rounds. Melee weapons, on the other hand, can be a little frustrating. I understand that the enemies pose a direct symbolism to James and his character arc, but that doesn't stop them from being extremely repetitive. Now, I am not good at video games. Considering I've been playing them most of my life and am now making videos on them, I'm still much closer to bad at video games than I am to good. I tend to dislike being quote-unquote challenged by them. Especially if I'm in the mood to advance in whatever game I'm playing and not just dick around for an afternoon. I play games to have fun, relax, and try to forget about whatever sucks in my life at the moment. I like to have a difficulty that isn't a cakewalk, but won't make me want to smash the controller because I fail over and over and over at the same spot. I'm not someone who gets a feeling of accomplishment from beating an overly tough section or blasting through a game on its highest difficulty settings. If I'm playing a game on its toughest settings, it's because I really like that game. I bring that quick rant up because, even by my low set of standards, Silent Hill 2 is really fucking easy. On easy, normal, and hard modes, you will be given plenty of ammo and health. Really an overly necessary amount on both easy and normal modes. You could shoot and kill every enemy and not have to worry about when the next ammo stash is coming. On hard mode, bosses seem to move a little faster while definitely taking and dealing more damage. But even hard is still easy once you get used to the tank controls. Common enemies still won't pose much of a threat, while bosses will without question get some cheap hits in. That really won't bother you much though, because unless you played like an idiot, you'll have more than enough health to counter those cheap hits. Honestly, the hardest enemy you'll fight the whole game is the camera angle. When I was a kid, I remember the camera being a little annoying, but that's about it. By today's standards, it can be downright infuriating. I'm so used to having the over-the-shoulder or first-person angles that this kept driving me nuts. Mostly because you can still usually move the camera behind James or position it where you aren't running blind into monsters. What makes this so annoying is having to constantly reset the camera to your liking. I feel like the game should have left it set in fixed angles and made you see what they chose, or left it stationed behind James whenever the gameplay allowed. Mixing a floating camera, tank controls, and a joystick meant that moving James in a straight line was pretty damn annoying to do at times. I find myself playing with the D-pad rather than the joystick because it gave me way more control over James's movement. Rather than being worried about monsters and what's in a new area, my first worry was usually repositioning the camera and then taking in what was around me. Every now and then I found myself popping up the map repeatedly after getting turned in the wrong direction from too many different camera angles. Because this is an old school survival horror game, you can expect to get lost a couple times while looking for keys and which routes to advance. For example, this cutscene is one of the more memorable moments in the game and really the whole series. I had my nostalgia goggles on and was just watching and having a good time. Well, I forgot to remember that there's a quick glimpse of a key on the dresser. In all of my backtracking and running around aimlessly, I also didn't think to go back into the goddamn closet that James hid in. Yes, it's my fault for not paying attention to detail, but it's also a showing of how much video games have changed. Our hands are held quite a bit more nowadays than they were back in 2001, and that cost me about an hour of running down the same 3 hallways until I said the hell with it and went to GameFAQs for the first time in God knows how long. Another example was running around the town prior to the Historical Society level. Again, this was more my fault, but it shows how simplified video games have become. I felt like I ran everywhere, but of course missed that this was a little straight line on my map, which means you can go through, as opposed to the squiggly line, which means it's a dead end. We've gotten spoiled. Modern games pretty much yell at you where to go and give waypoints or distances to make sure you're still on the right track. Silent Hill 2 is nowhere near as large of a game as anything newer, but the figure it out on your own style will feel outdated to a lot of people. You will have times where you get lost and go through rooms several times over while mashing X all around the walls looking for items. It's not an every 15-minute occurrence by any means, but most players will have a couple moments of frustratedly thinking out loud, where the fuck do I have to go? In a way, it's kind of refreshing to have that freedom of not knowing exactly what to look for, but it doesn't quite feel refreshing when you're doing the aimless backtracking. The last major gripe I have is a bit of a double-edged sword. The atmosphere and tension that builds as you play is fantastic. Even in 2021, it's still as good as anything out today. As I said earlier, Silent Hill 2 makes you fear what you can't see. You're kept on edge by what might be around each corner or just out of the view of your flashlight. Ominous sounds and dramatic set pieces add significant stress while you're exploring Silent Hill. Well, towards the end of the game, you start to realize that what might be just outside your view isn't all that threatening. That all those ominous sounds almost never lead to anything unique or new. Subsequent playthroughs will have moments that make you question why you were even scared or anxious at all on your first go-around. Once you figure out how the game messes with you and that there's only a handful of different monsters in the town, it ruins a little bit of the aura. There's no inventory management, limited saves, or rationing of items to increase tensions, and after a couple hours, that hurts this game a lot from a horror perspective. Those survival horror gameplay cliches would really help to keep players a little more on edge once you start to pick up that there usually aren't going to be any new surprises thrown your way. However, I say it's a double-edged sword because Team Silent did an amazing job at covering up this problem. The plot is a slow burn here. By the time that the combat and scares start to get predictable, the storyline is really piecing itself together. You'll get the conclusion to Angela and Eddie's stories, and you'll get a few more boss fights. Your attention is focused on James and the characters rather than seeing repetitive monsters. When enemies have become stale and you start getting overconfident, they throw Pyramid Head wandering around at you a couple times. Once you get to the hotel, your mind drifts towards finding Mary and wrapping up the main plot, not how many mannequins you've run past. While the actual scares might get more predictable by the end, Silent Hill 2 puts plenty of interesting content in front of you to keep the player fully invested when the gameplay really starts to lag behind the narrative. Whereas most horror titles focus on fighting your way out and escaping from whatever scenario you're stuck in, Silent Hill 2 focuses on diving deeper into town and figuring out just what the hell is going on. Regardless of the ending you get, there's no frantic escapes, no timers, intense chases, or exploding bombs. It's just a guy leaving at his own pace and on his own terms, which is kind of a nice change of pace compared to the usual climax of horror titles. As for getting in depth with the characters and the plot, it's probably best to talk about in sequence with the events of the game. As we talked about earlier, Silent Hill 2 does a great job of making James seem like a sad sack of a person right off the bat. He really has no personality or defining features. We don't know what he does for work or what any of his interests are. He's just a guy. We also never really see much of Mary. Outside of her illness, we also don't ever learn much about her either. I feel like this is intentionally done. The depressing scenario around James and Mary is described in depth, yet the two characters are almost like blank canvases. In a weird way, not having characters with defining traits lets the player's mind wander to how they would react if they were in James and Mary's situation. It lets the player illustrate themselves into those blank canvases. It could have come off as very boring. Instead, they nailed it and somehow made a story about loss and murder kinda relatable. Just like in Silent Hill 1, you can watch an intro video at the title screen. While there is a bit of story information thrown out here, what really stands out to me is the music. This game has a fucking awesome soundtrack. It's criminally underrated. Where it shines is with, for lack of a better term, its actual music. When people think of Silent Hill, they tend to think of the violent crashing of heavy industrial sound effects playing in the background, or the creepy strings opening of the Silent Hill 1 theme. Silent Hill 2 takes a pretty large step in the opposite direction. Surprisingly, most of it is pretty chill stuff. While it does still borrow a little of the creepiness and industrial effects from its predecessor, most of the Silent Hill 2 music is kind of a cross between easy listening and indie rock. Give or take, about half the soundtrack is still more the background, white noise style ambience, but the other half is genuinely good music that sounds like it could appear randomly on a Spotify playlist. Despite my favorite music coming from metal bands like the Black Dahlia Murder, Bellacore, and Allegiant, I found myself listening to the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack when I was looking for something more on the chill side. So finally, onto the fucking game. Right off the bat, Silent Hill 2 does a great job of making the player feel uneasy. The long path through the woods has no danger, but is filled with eerie sounds that make you constantly think something is just around the corner. We quickly meet the first supporting character, Angela. Despite her older-looking appearance, she's only 19 years old here. I remembered Angela's backstory, but didn't quite grasp the severity and detail they put into her scenes when I was a kid. She's not even in the game for very long, but almost all of her screen time is pretty uncomfortable through the eyes of an adult. Angela tries to warn James of the dangers in the town, yet James shrugs it off and goes to walk away. Angela takes offense and yells out how she's not lying. The change in her pitch and volume during this hints at accusations of her lying being a sore subject. When James says he believes her, Angela immediately goes back to normal. Oddly enough, Angela also mentions that she's looking for people, specifically her mother, but also her father and brother, but can't seem to find any of them. The second she opens up, she starts apologizing for simply talking about herself. Angela is an all too realistic character with a litany of mental health issues resulting from an abusive childhood. On the surface, James's interactions with her come off as awkward and socially inept, but once we reveal more of her plot, it's really pretty tragic the more each line of her dialogue gets broken down. After leaving Angela, we start to encounter the monsters of Silent Hill. With how disconnected James is from reality, it kind of makes sense that he doesn't have much of a reaction to seeing these things or beating them to death with a stick. James isn't really taking any of this in, he's just trudging forward. If it doesn't have anything to do with Mary, he doesn't really care.
You remember feelings, right? Yeah, I have feelings every single day of my life. Do you? Are you saying you don't have feelings?
Yeah, that's kind of James at the moment. Hell, he doesn't even care enough to close his car door in the first scene. Exploring the town works as somewhat of a tutorial. You have plenty of room to maneuver the camera, smack around some enemies, and get a feel for the controls. If you explore a bit, you'll find notes that tell us everyone is not seeing the same things. This means that Angela doesn't see what James sees and vice versa. The town fills itself with things specific to each person and their past, which will later turn into a big plot point. This means that those enemies, called the lying figures, can have several ways of interpreting them. I always assumed that they represented Mary dealing with the disease. They're trapped in their own bodies and vomit on you as a means of attacking. It sounds a lot like a metaphor for someone stuck in their own body with a terminal illness. Not to mention that at one point in the story, Mary also says she thinks she looks like a monster to James. Once you're done exploring the town, James makes his way to the apartment complex. Upon finding the flashlight, we'll run into another enemy type, the mannequin. These should be pretty self-explanatory. It's kinda taboo in the case of a dying spouse, but sex is a human desire. Just because you have a significant other doesn't mean you start thinking every other person is revolting. I don't think it's ever implied that James was cheating, but these thoughts of other women and the guilt from having them are another reason for James to self-loathe. The lying figures can be kind of annoying when trying to attack them with a melee weapon, but the mannequins are complete pushovers. It's soon after that we get our first glimpse of probably the most recognizable character from the whole franchise in Pyramid Head. Now, Pyramid Head isn't quite like the rest of the stalker enemies that you'll encounter in horror games. Whether it's a version of the Tyrant, Lara from The Evil Within, Scissorman, or the Xenomorph, they all tend to come in with a bang or are foreshadowed big time before the first encounter. Not Pyramid Head. He kinda just shows up and watches you. It's a shame that Pyramid Head became so popular, and any new players would very likely know it's him standing on the other side of those bars. When I first played this, that was fucking eerie. You didn't know who or what it was, but the game made sure you knew that someone was watching you. Running from an enemy like Nemesis got the adrenaline going and was exciting, but then it was done and you knew you were safe for the time being. Silent Hill 2 made Pyramid Head creepy and kept you wondering why he was simply watching you. The next time we see him, it's heavily implied that he's raping other monsters. When he stops and looks for James in the closet, he doesn't attack. Once again, he just watches you. Almost looking like he's trying to peel back the metal helmet to get a better look. James takes a couple shots and he flees. To me, this seems like a much more animalistic way of creating a character. Almost like a natural predator stalking its prey. Watching and learning before making a real attack. Every other time we see Pyramid Head throughout the game, there's no dramatic entrance or fireworks accompanying. You turn a corner and there he is. At first you're not quite sure if he's there to specifically hunt down James, or if the two of you were simply sharing the same space. In one of the grossest sound effects I can remember, we get introduced to Eddie while he's barfing into a toilet. We obviously don't believe him when he says he doesn't know anything about the dead body, but he also seems harmless at the same time. Eddie agrees that he should get out of Silent Hill, and even stops barfing for a second to tell James to be careful too. It's a pretty uneventful introduction, but as the intro trailer reveals, we'll see a much darker side of Eddie later on. After a little more exploring, we run into Angela again. This time the conversation gets pretty weird pretty quickly. The main takeaway here is the heavy implication that Angela is contemplating suicide. James tries to talk her off the ledge, and she accuses him of being just like her, while going as far as to mock him by asking if he's afraid of doing it. Angela's accusations come off as a little forced. James's lack of care to her previous warnings about the town do give her a little insight into his mental state, but I don't know. It's a weird transition. For someone as skittish and apology heavy as Angela has been so far, it seems off that she'd so quickly mock James. To me, it seems she was given the line simply as a plot device, as a reason for James to deny being suicidal. It gives the player reason to think that James is the normal one and Angela is the mentally unstable character. James doesn't seem all there at the moment either, but he's definitely holding it together better than she is. However, we do get to see just how unstable and traumatized Angela really is. After accusing him of being afraid to commit suicide, she subtly transitions into a distrust of James. It's quick and easy to miss, but she gets noticeably uncomfortable around him after he mentions that Mary is dead. When James turns around, she pulls back her knife and abruptly tries to leave the room. In hindsight, it makes a lot more sense that she wouldn't trust James here. With the abuse she's suffered at the hands of her family, James admitting he's looking for his dead wife and hoping he's not crazy is a big fucking red flag, even to someone as unstable as Angela. James simply reaching out in her direction to take the knife that she asked him to hold causes her to panic. Her apologies are really sad here, especially the last one. All her childhood trauma has left her to assume that any of her words or actions could result in physical abuse against her. This knife will stay on our inventory all game, but there isn't anything we can do with it other than examine it. It won't be much longer that we'll get our first boss fight. Once again, James walks in on Pyramid Head going at it with another monster. Uncomfortable moans and all. It's a creepy detail that further reinforces Pyramid Head isn't just a normal monster like the rest. It has desires and derives audible pleasure from what it's doing to these other creatures. The fight is pretty basic though. Keep your distance and fire off enough shots until Pyramid Head flees and opens up a new area. It does have a lot of potential to get pretty annoying though. 9 out of 10 times, his attacks will be incredibly slow and you'd honestly have to try to not dodge them. Then out of nowhere, one swing will speed up and will follow you as you run, very likely killing you in one hit. There's also one spot in the room where James somehow seems to get stuck against a flat wall, which can lead to a couple cheap deaths. This fight marks the end of the apartment complex level. Outside of the character cutscenes, it's somewhat of a forgettable area. This level in particular didn't age that well. Most of the rooms and hallways tend to look very similar, and there aren't a ton of creepy moments outside of Pyramid Head, who was definitely the MVP of this section. His presence is what keeps the player mostly on edge. Once we're outside, the game replenishes us big time on ammo and health. Pyramid Head's great knife swings are all or nothing attacks. Unless you get hit by a bunch of those little run-by side swipes, James is very likely coming out of that fight taking no damage, yet there are a ton of health items around town. You can easily rattle off 50 rounds of ammo during that fight, but you will get all that back and then some. Having such a surplus of ammo really does take away some of the tension. We do get a proper introduction to Lara outside the apartments. On the surface, Lara is the game's cliche asshole little kid who runs away a lot and causes you to keep looking for them character. Whereas Eddie and Angela mostly work as supporting characters who are more for expanding the backstory of Silent Hill and the town's lore, Lara will play a big role in the game's central plot. It's a quick interaction that abruptly ends when Lara accuses James of never loving Mary in the first place. The fact that Lara knows who Mary was and makes this accusation is the first seed of doubt that things aren't quite how James remembers them. A few more steps and we finish up with a lightning round of character introductions. This time with Maria, who tends to look and sound exactly like Mary. This is where I wish the game had a little more backstory or focus on Mary's character. The only way we know that Maria looks and sounds like Mary is because James tells the audience so. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but I would have liked Maria's introduction a lot more had I been able to think to myself, well, this is weird. That's Mary's voice actress, and those two have the same face. Alright, this is a thing now. And then had James back up what I was already thinking. Instead, James immediately has to tell us that she looks and sounds like Mary, but isn't Mary. I don't know, it seems a bit clunky, but I'm probably asking for too much from an old PlayStation 2 game. Maria is extremely bipolar in how she treats James. Most of the time she's overly flirtatious with him, but as we'll soon enough see, that can change on a dime. There is one line towards the end of this cutscene that is another clue hidden right in front of the player. We get a second character accusing James of hating Mary. With our introduction into Maria's character and personality, this line comes off as nothing more than Maria manipulating James into protecting her. But the whole, you look and sound exactly like my dead wife except sexier, that bit should be more than enough to raise caution that something about Maria is off here. I know I said I'd follow with the plot of the game, but I feel like this needs an exception. Long story short, Maria isn't a real person. She's created by the town as a way of either screwing with or leading James, depending on your perspective and the ending you receive. This isn't a situation like Lisa Garland from Silent Hill 1, whereas she was a real person at one point in time. Maria was never real outside of James's version of Silent Hill. I also won't be getting into the side story Born from a Wish Maria scenario. It wasn't included in the base game, and, in my opinion at least, really kind of contrasts with the Maria that we see in the rest of Silent Hill 2. Anyway, for the time being, we're stuck in a survival horror escort mission, and it's surprisingly not that bad. Maria's AI does a good job of keeping up with James and not putting herself in harm's way. In rooms where danger is immediate, she'll warp further in the back of the room instead of just starting off right next to or behind James. The biggest issue is her catching a blow and passing that a monster initially aimed at James running past. For being made in 2001, it's not that bad. Unless you shoot her right in the face, keeping Maria alive isn't hard. When I talked about ammo and health being overabundant earlier, this is what I meant. I currently had 112 handgun bullets, 5 first aid kits, and 10 health drinks on a normal difficulty playthrough at this point in the game. The footage here is my second playthrough because I jacked up the resolution on the first screen capture. This game is already grainy enough, I didn't think people would want to watch a 480p resolution on top of that. This means I knew where to go and what was coming. I still had that much ammo and health while not going out of my way to look for any extra. This is what I'm talking about when I say that the game is easy. The handgun is too overpowered and stockpiles of ammo can take away a lot of the player's apprehension. I could be completely misremembering, but I have a lot of memories of using mainly melee weapons in Silent Hill 1, and guns on pretty much just the bosses or in rooms with multiple nurses. Once you get the handgun, you're probably never going to use a melee weapon again in Silent Hill 2. This is now the second time we've been able to really run around and explore the town. It's during these segments that I really get bummed out by all the never-fulfilled Silent Hill reboot rumors. A properly made, partially open-world Silent Hill game with today's technology would be fucking awesome. They did a very good job of making Silent Hill seem like a real town, but its own limitations of the times are on full display here. The bones and structure of a full city is already in place, from housing and shops to streetlights that actively change colors. It would just be really fun to experience and explore the town of Silent Hill with modern graphics and technology. For any South Park fans, when you first played The Stick of Truth or The Fractured But Whole, did you waste time just running around and exploring the town? I know I sure as shit did. After watching the cartoon for so many years, I wanted to see what the town had to offer. That example can't be much more of a polar opposite from Silent Hill, but I feel like an updated version of this, or really any of the early Silent Hill titles, would have the same effect on players. Once we make our way to the bowling alley, the game progresses, and this whole transition is a bit clunky, even by PS2 standards. There is a bit of a plot convenience here, as Maria stays outside because she says she hates bowling. We see Eddie and Lara together inside, and it makes sense why she'd wait outside now. Lara knows Mary, and her seeing the slutty doppelganger Maria would open a whole new can of worms that the player isn't supposed to know about at the moment. It also begs the question if Eddie or Lara would see Maria in the same vein as James does, or if they'd even see her at all. Easiest way around it? Maria is kinda bitchy and stays outside. Eddie and Lara together is a bit weirder though, as it's only shown very briefly in the pregame cinematic that the two drive into Silent Hill together. Without seeing that 2-second optional scene, you're going to be very confused as to what Lara and Eddie's relationship is. This scene implies that they know something of each other, and the in-game dialogue and cutscenes never quite explain that relationship. Not to mention the, let's say, issues or stigma associated with a man in his early 20s picking up a random 8-year-old girl in his van and fleeing to a new town. Creepy sentiments aside, Eddie seems to act pretty nicely towards Lara. Eddie's issues with self-worth and bullying are what brought him to Silent Hill in the first place. Yet when Lara insults him, he just shrugs it off. Once again, Eddie tries to feign innocence towards a violent act when he denies that he fled because the cops were after him. Once James comes in, Lara runs off, and we see that maybe Eddie did take Lara's comment a little personally. When James says that the two of them need to keep Lara safe from the monsters in town, Eddie also shrugs off that idea. On a side note, a running gag I remember seeing around this game was where exactly Eddie found a pizza in this setting. Remember, Lara doesn't see what Eddie, Maria, Angela, and James see. She sees the normal Silent Hill that James remembers vacationing to. To Lara, this was just a bowling alley that probably sold pizza. Later in the game, James and Angela's versions of the town start to slightly bleed together. The most likely explanation is Lara and Eddie's did as well in this instance. Another answer could also be that Eddie has accepted his obesity and comfort eating, so the town manifested a pizza since food is his vice of choice. Or quite simply, the game developers wanted to reiterate how gluttonous Eddie is, so they just said fuck it, he's eating a whole pizza during this scene because who cares? While looking for Lara, James and Maria take a shortcut through a strip club. It's implied that Maria works here, seeing as she has all 3 keys for the door, and coyly smiles at James while using them. James's sexual frustrations are a huge underlying plot point in the game, and this is no different. James probably hit up more than a few strip clubs while Mary was in the hospital, not to mention that he admits to drinking a fair bit during her illness too. His feelings of guilt and dealing with temptation while doing this have helped the town create the persona of Maria. James doesn't fantasize of other women as much as he dreamed of his wife being healthy and attractive again. He fantasized of her being sexually active and infatuated with him. But he also feels like shit for thinking with his dick while Mary's dealing with a terminal illness. All these thoughts going around in James's head are where Maria comes from. Our chase of Lara leads to the second big destination, Brookhaven Hospital. This dungeon is fleshed out significantly more than the apartments. Brookhaven wasn't just a normal medical hospital, but also a hospital for the mentally ill. Like so many mental institutions in the real world, Silent Hill's own Brookhaven was also a corrupt and dangerous place to find yourself as a patient. Notes of abuse from doctors and implied violence from patients wandering freely are scattered throughout the level to add depth and creepiness. It makes the hospital a much more memorable experience than the apartment complex, in my opinion. Shortly after we enter the hospital, we get to see a staple enemy of the franchise, the nurses. These nurses look much different than the enemies from Silent Hill 1, and that's because these are a direct symbolism of James's said sexual frustrations. Again, look at the nurses and doctor enemies in Part 1 compared to these. Despite Lisa being shown as a very attractive girl, she nor any of the other transformed nurses are shown as being over-sexualized or even remotely sexualized. They're monsters through and through. Those nurses were formed through the twisted memories of Alessa, who had no reason to think of them sexually. However, in James's Silent Hill, the nurses wear short skirts and show off cleavage. Another big detail is how they all have blank or distorted faces. It further shows how James wasn't interested in other girls as relationships or individual people. He was just looking at them as something he desired. This design, along with their shaky movements inspired from the film Jacob's Ladder, has become the popularized and most frequently used character model of the nurse in the series. After a bit of exploring, Maria will need to take a rest, all while blaming it on a hangover. She pops some pills and passes out in a room that would make a crackhead uncomfortable to sleep in, while James just trudges on. There are diary notes of a sick patient on the roof, which a lot of players are led to believe are notes from Mary. This isn't the case, and it's just notes of a random patient used to build the world up a little bit more. Game creators have confirmed that Mary was never a patient in Brookhaven Hospital. It's up on the roof that we get one of the best oh shit scares of the game. Once you corner yourself in a section of the roof, you'll hear the scrape of Pyramid Head's great knife. You only hear that scrape for a couple seconds before the cutscene, but those couple seconds are more than enough to make the player panic. His attack transitions us into a new part of the hospital, and unless you got hit during the boss fight against him in the apartments, this is likely the most damage you will have taken all game. It's also a chilling realization that Pyramid Head isn't confined to the apartments. He's officially out to get James. I enjoyed the puzzles in this section of the game way more than the apartments too. The clock and coin puzzles were fairly obvious, but also could be solved with just trial and error. More so than that, they didn't offer anything in terms of world building. They were just there. The lockbox and drain puzzles aren't exactly riddles as much as they are finding numbers to unlock key items, but they do help set the tone of this level. Numbers written in blood on padded cell walls that are used to open a lockbox that only contains human hair? That's fucking weird and deserves to be in a mental hospital setting. It helps set the tone and fits in this level. Once these puzzles are solved, we run across Lara playing with stuffed animals. Once again, this scene serves as a good reminder that Lara isn't seeing what James sees. But more importantly, it also gives us another push that James's memories aren't quite accurate. Lara claims to have been friends with Mary and first met her last year, to which James lashes out and calls her a liar. James collects himself and tries to leave the hospital now that he's found Lara, but of course it can't be that easy. In one of my least favorite video game cliches, Lara will be the normal, asshole little kid that needs to keep running off and locks us in a room with the next boss encounter. We'll fight two at first, and then a faster third will appear after one is killed. These enemies are called the Flesh Lips, and these are a little harder to decipher what the symbolism here is. I've seen everything from James has a foot fetish, to it's Mary being confined in her bed and verbally abusing James. This enemy is a little open to player interpretation, and honestly, I'm not quite sure what it is. As for the actual fight, it's not too bad. It's the usual run around, keep your distance, and pop off a few shots, but the small area means you need to keep James moving a lot. In a game like this, the extra running around does make it more fun than a lot of the other bosses. I used the handgun against them during this capture because, well, it drags out the footage, but the shotgun will make much quicker work of them. Take down the bosses, and veterans of the first game will know exactly what that siren means. We're finally heading to the alternate world. Silent Hill 2's version isn't quite as hellish and blood-covered as its predecessors. In Silent Hill 1, we saw the alternate world through the eyes of Alessa. We'll get quick glimpses into Eddie and Angela's visions, but for the most part, everything is through the eyes of James as he unravels his own mysteries. Nurses appear more frequently, everything is darker, and the halls have taken on a much more rustic visual. The first hallway probably has the most violent look though. The rest of the time, the game keeps a lot of the same darker navy greens and blues we've already been seeing, but covers them in a little more muck and dirt. There's a sneaky little glass breaking scene and an ominous note about the hospital having another basement beneath the basement, and even the crazy dude that wrote the letter is scared of going in there. It's things like this that give Silent Hill 2 its due respect as an all-time great horror game, building tension and unease through world building and game design, not cheap repetitive jump scares. This is also the first time in the game that we're running low on handgun ammo. It doesn't really matter though, since I've still got 42 shotgun rounds and plenty of health. Quick side note, and this one's a bummer. This is probably one of the least fun shotguns in a horror game. Shotguns in games are usually the most fun weapons to use. Here, it's just a more powerful gun. There's no specific aiming or blowing off body parts that most games incorporate to give the shotgun some extra kick compared to other weapons. Yes, it'll blow back an enemy that's close, but it doesn't feel as satisfying as other games. Any other time, I'd be pumped to switch to only using the shotgun for the foreseeable future, but here, it was just business as usual. 1 or 2 shots instead of 3 to down an enemy. Nothing special. Carry on. Go back and visit the room where Maria napped, and in turn, she's no longer there. James questions the medicine that she was taking, and there's no music, just the sounds of someone breathing through a ventilator. Explore a little bit further, and it's time to hit that basement's basement section. We're greeted by the sound of what seems like a mix between a pig's squeal and a baby's cry. I couldn't really remember this part of the game from when I was a kid, but I did not want to go in there. There's more shotgun shells and a player prompt to move a shelf covered in bloody handprints. A very ominous tone has been set. And instead of any scares, we get a scene of Maria running in and verbally berating, then confiding in James. This is where Maria really starts to turn into more of an actual Silent Hill doppelganger for Mary than she does her own separate character. This quick dialogue mirrors how Mary would treat James during her illness, which caused James's visits to happen more and more infrequently. This is a big moment in terms of storytelling, but feels like a little bit of a letdown in terms of gameplay. You just grab the item and leave the basement, but now Maria is here. That's it. It's pretty anticlimactic. Once in the elevator, we get probably the most divisive part of the game. Maria and James are greeted by a cheesy announcer who asks questions in the form of an old school game show. Horrible puns and crowd cheering included. I'm on the fence about this. It's definitely out of place, but it does reinforce that the town is literally fucking with James. There's also something unsettling about the announcer being excited to talk about 2 children being murdered with an axe in broad daylight. It seems to be a very big take it or leave it scene with fans. Having Maria blatantly be dismissive and ask, "What was that?" doesn't quite help make it resonate with the player either. Should you choose to go to the storeroom, you'll get even more supplies that you likely won't need. After Maria belittles James for not being strong enough to open the fridge, we get the final item, which lets us leave the hospital. Before that can happen, we get another sneak attack from Pyramid Head. James is forced to watch as Maria is killed right in front of him and screaming for his help. The game does a good job of making sure the player knows this is meant as a big deal. Like most horror games, Silent Hill 2 isn't an overly long game, and Maria has only been with us for about an hour or so. Had it been treated like a normal death and everything went back to normal when the elevator opened, it could easily lose a lot of its impact. Instead, when the scene advances, James is sitting on the ground with his back to the open door. It gives the impression that for the first time, he might not want to continue his journey through Silent Hill. This is one of only a few times that the music doesn't switch from area to area, and the slow, sad track keeps playing throughout the final steps of the hospital. Once James exits back to the streets, we see him do a little bit of self-loathing over both Maria's death and letting Laura run away. James himself drops the next hint about something being off in his search for Mary. He seemingly starts to think, is this Mary's way of taking revenge? Before he can even finish the thought, James gives himself a little pep talk about finding Mary and it being the only thing left that he has. We traverse the streets of Silent Hill once more, but this time in the alternate version of the town. And it's not much different. just darker. After Maria's death and the quick internal thoughts of self-hatred James just had, I kinda wish this version of the town was a little more beat up. It doesn't have to be the full-blown, running around on blood-stained chain-link fence while in the rain that Silent Hill 1 and 3 had, but a little more grit here would have been a nice touch. This is supposed to be tied to James's thoughts, and it would still fall in line with his ever-worsening mental state. While searching for items, we find a note written directly to James. If somehow you haven't figured out by now that there's something clearly wrong with his memories of Mary, this is a dead giveaway. The note ends with the cryptic message of, "If you do not wish to stop James, I pray the Lord to have mercy on your eternal soul." Yeah, that's not usually something you'd say about someone who was a model husband. Should you veer from the normal path, you can find another not-so-subtle hint of something being off with James. The message here flat out says that James should just die and that he's not going to the same afterlife as Mary. Plenty of damning evidence that James isn't as helpless as we're led to believe. Eventually we stumble upon the third level of the game, the Silent Hill Historical Society. This is a fan favorite level throughout the whole franchise, and I completely see why. This dungeon is a clusterfuck of James's cracking sanity and is the most blatant use of the town's supernatural aspects that we see in the game. Since this is kind of a running gag now, we are also entering this stage with 20 health drinks, 15 first aid kits, 3 ampules, back up to 87 handgun bullets, 62 shotgun slugs, and 8 rounds for the hunting rifle, a gun that we haven't even gotten yet. Did I mention yet that Silent Hill 2 is easy? Back to the Historical Society though. Throughout this level, we get a ton of metaphors for diving into James's thoughts and subconscious. The first of which is a very long downward staircase that acts as the doorway to the level. Oh yeah, probably worth noting that there's a picture of Pyramid Head on the wall here, and the title is Misty Day, Remains of the Judgment. Little by little, the characters and even now the notes left throughout the town have been throwing some pretty heavy shade James's way. We've already seen that Pyramid Head isn't just some thoughtless predator out to get you, but now we get hints that his stalking of James is a judgment rather than indiscriminate violence. If you followed the clues, you should have no idea what to think of the character you're controlling. Is the town simply trying to fool you into thinking James is an evil person, or is there truly something sinister about him that we have yet to uncover? A reoccurring set piece of the Historical Society are these deep holes that James must dive down in to advance. At first he's tepid and tries to get a glimpse of what might be down at the bottom. However, with each new pit, James gets more and more reckless about stepping in. After encountering a few more of these, he just flies on down and seems to be more annoyed than scared. There is a cool little puzzle here where James's flashlight battery will run out. Upon changing to a new one, we're locked in a room with bugs that will keep attacking until we guess the correct door combination to escape. After jumping down the second pit, we run into Eddie and are greeted to one of the most awkward hellos ever. While the player is starting to see the cracks in James's mental state, Eddie is all but on his breaking point. What James sees as monsters, Eddie sees as normal people that are just mocking him. Only difference is, here in Silent Hill, there aren't any consequences for Eddie taking out his anger on those people. Once he snaps back into reality, Eddie will run off after telling James he was just joking about killing people. The Historical Society has a couple perfect examples of Silent Hill 2's less is more approach to horror, the first of which being the jail cell hallway. The occult aspect of the town from Part 1 is mostly all but forgotten in Silent Hill 2, except for one jail cell. We hear a ghostly voice repeat the word ritual over and over while James is in the area of the cell, and there's another enemy off camera somewhere that we aren't able to kill. This is a room that we'll be running back and forth through a couple times and really makes the player paranoid that whatever is off camera may attack at any time. They even put in an animation to have James look at and acknowledge that something we can't see is certainly there. Also, there's the visiting rooms to the northwest. This is a very subtle yet genius way to make the player uncomfortable. Notice that the broken desk and wall is facing the same direction that James is heading. Whatever came charging through here and did this, we're going the same way it did. Lastly, there is a fantastically placed jump scare in the bathroom. I had forgotten all about this one somehow, and on my first playthrough, I couldn't get the fuck out of that room fast enough. As I said all the way back in the beginning of this video, the only downside is that these are all superficial. Yes, they're scary and help build a tense mood, yet that's all that they do. There isn't any kind of payoff. Your second go around, it's all nothing but white noise and psychological tricks. There's nothing new here to encounter or anything out of the ordinary that will eventually pose a threat to James's safety. This all could have been remedied somewhat easily in my opinion. When you first enter the gallows area, it's a section that screams boss fight. It's a wide open area with nothing in it except a hanging station. Once you enter the 3 tablets, a loud scream is heard, and again, nothing happens. We exit the room to find a horseshoe on the door handle, and we continue on. Why not make another boss fight here? With all the extra room to maneuver, this could have been the perfect area to introduce a quicker boss. All the boss fights in this game are essentially run to a corner, take a few shots, avoid the boss by running to another corner, and repeating the process. If we had the opportunity to do that here, but with a more nimble, quicker moving enemy, it could have had a payoff to some of the creepy foreshadowing and provided a change of pace encounter. Instead, once again, whole lot of build-up without a payoff. It's a glaring weakness of Silent Hill 2. Gameplay issues like this are really the one thing that holds this game back. Down in the next sections of this level, we get one of the coolest bonus weapons in gaming. I guess it's not really a bonus weapon because it's always available, but whatever, you get the idea. And that's Pyramid Head's Great Knife. This isn't practical to use at all. Its very slow attack animation takes a while to get used to, and even worse, it makes your movement speed so slow that equipping the weapon and trying to advance in the game is basically impossible. However, it is pretty fun to screw around with. This is where having an abundance of health items is great. In a game this bleak, taking a quick break to smack shit with the Great Knife will make you smile. Traverse around the now maze-like area and we meet back up with Maria. Yes, Maria is still alive after her run-in with Pyramid Head. James is rightfully confused, but Maria pretends that she was never killed. This and its subsequent scene are the perfect examples of how the town of Silent Hill is both fucking with James and leading him towards the hotel. In order to calm James down and manipulate him, Maria starts talking about a videotape that was left at the hotel years ago, something only Mary would know about. In the beginning of this scene, Maria is acting as close to Mary as we'll see all game. Once James takes the bait, Maria goes back to being a whore, lays on the seduction, and convinces him to find her because...
Come and get me. I can't do anything through these bars.
I've seen plenty of videos online that would suggest otherwise, but James isn't the type to argue. Instead, we search for Maria's side of the room. The dialogue and production of this cutscene is so well done though. So far, almost all of the character interactions have been awkward and used as a way to show that everyone is just a bit off mentally. Here, Maria sounds very natural and direct. She sounds like she's talking as a real person, trying to sound sexy and get what she wants. There's no bipolar tones or uncomfortable scenes here. It's so good that it doesn't feel weird that our next goal in a game like this is essentially to get James laid. On the way, Pyramid Head makes a quick appearance down in the tunnels as well. Seeing as how it's been established that Pyramid Head is manifested as a means of judgment for James, it's a nice touch to throw him in this section. For the first time in his journey through Silent Hill, James's goal hasn't been centered around finding Mary. Now it's about finding Maria. Pyramid Head showing himself here is a fantastic use of in-game storytelling. His presence here is to judge James's current thought process and actions. On the way to Maria's room, we get a pretty uncomfortable climax to Angela's portion of the story. At first, the newspaper clippings don't have much meaning until we piece together that the man being talked about is Angela's father. The knife she gave us earlier in the apartments was the weapon she used to murder him while he was forcing himself on her, and not for the first time. For a minute, it seems as though James's version of Silent Hill merges with Angela's. Newspapers about her father's murder litter the hallways, and we find Angela in a room that seemingly has flesh for walls. These walls also have gyrating pistons all around as well as visible handprints. The boss we fight is called the Abstract Daddy and deals damage to you by literally mounting James and holding his head down. Yeah, not too subtle are the implications here. After the boss dies, Angela accuses James of trying to be nice to her as a means of getting, quote, one thing. The sexual abuse Angela suffered from her family carried over into her view of all men. She admits that her father always beat her up and forced himself on her, so now anytime any other man was being nice to her, she always assumed they were only doing it as a different means of getting into her pants as well. There's no good cop, bad cop style Angela here as we've seen earlier. No constant apologies after an outburst. She just berates James and leaves. Right after this encounter, we're forced to solve a quick puzzle in which we have to figure out who the innocent man that still got hung was. With everyone voicing their judgments in James's direction, and the game now blatantly telling us that there's something up with his memories, this puzzle is pretty well timed. It can create that quick seed of doubt that if we're finding the innocent man who was still accused, then maybe that's what's happening to James right now too. Or maybe it's just a puzzle, who knows. What we do know is that James finds Maria dead upon his arrival. For the second time, we get to see Maria die. She's DOA when James gets there, and we can only assume that Pyramid Head is once again responsible. To complete the rapid-fire character segments, we get a close to Eddie's arc. He seems at peace with what he's learned about himself in Silent Hill. For once, Eddie feels like he has all the power and confidence after killing anyone that taunts him, which is everyone he sees in town, and that now includes James. Eddie has fully embraced his murderous side and leads us into another boss fight. From a gameplay perspective, it's a nice change of pace. Eddie fighting with his revolver means we can't just stand in front of him and rattle off shots while barely moving. If we get too close, he'll also charge in and punch at James. Only downside is we have so many health items that this fight basically turns into the Silent Hill version of a turn-based combat system. You'll very likely do just what I said and stand in front of each other while trading off shots with a healing item or two thrown in, and then Eddie goes down. While he's not as innocent as Angela, there is a tragic aspect to Eddie's character arc as well. He's a typical case of someone being pushed over the edge from a lifetime of bullying. It's why he seemed so comfortable earlier just sitting around eating pizza. While Eddie was picked on for his appearance and weight, food was likely a comfort for him. That scene of him carelessly binging on pizza was also his comfort as he first starts to accept himself as a killer. I say he's also not as tragic as Angela because I feel like the line about him torturing and killing a dog was very deliberate. A lot of serial killers or people with violent mental issues initially start with harming animals and then move on to people. After killing a classmate's dog and then shooting out his knee, Eddie flees town. When Silent Hill calls out to him, Eddie fully embraces his violent side rather than showing any remorse. With Eddie dead and his story now closed, James can't believe that he killed a living person. However, this action does stir up some memories and makes him question whether Mary truly died 3 years ago or not. That wraps up the Historical Society, and it's on to the last level of the game, the Lakeview Hotel. The final stage of the game starts off relatively slow. Its format isn't any different than anything we've encountered prior, but the area does feel bigger. It's still very hallway-centric, but I don't know. It doesn't seem quite as cramped as the previous levels. After running around a little bit, James finds Laura waiting to try and scare him. This time Laura has the letter from Mary that she spoke about earlier. Mary references that she's now gone, and Laura is too young to make the connection that Mary really meant she had died. With each encounter, Laura has been more friendly with James, something Mary also asks of her in the letter, while finishing it off by wishing her a happy 8th birthday. James makes the connection that Mary couldn't have died 3 years ago, and seems to think the same as Laura, that maybe Mary really is in Silent Hill instead of being dead. Laura brings up another letter, one that I don't think we ever get to read, and runs off yet again to finish out their scene. One of the weird things in the hotel is that the abstract daddy boss has now turned into a smaller common enemy. According to the Silent Hill wiki, this wasn't in the original plans. It brings in some much needed enemy variants, but doesn't quite make sense why James would continue to see a monster that is far more of an Angela representation. As you explore the hotel and item hunt, there is a cool little scene waiting for you if you try and get to the 3rd floor without the key. As James turns around from the gate, you can hear Mary calling out to him. Her tone of voice almost makes it seem as if she knows he's right there, yet he's still turning away. It's a cool little trick to continue keeping the anticipation of finding Mary at the forefront of the player's thoughts. At this point in the game, James's inventory looks like he's been using a Game Shark. Let's get this dumb bit going one last time. As I was getting onto the elevator, I had 18 health drinks, 19 first aid kits, 5 ampules, 148 handgun bullets, 85 shotgun rounds, and 40 rifle rounds. Once again, this is the standard difficulty of the game. Well, now you're going to have none of that inventory for the next section. We can't use the elevator with all that extra weight. James is going in with no ammo or health, and it does make you feel very uneasy at first. Hell, you don't even have your flashlight or radio either. For the first time in hours, you feel underpowered, vulnerable, and anxious to face what's up next. But then, wouldn't you goddamn know it, right when you get into an area with monsters, you get a big serving of health items that essentially ruins the tension of exploring without your inventory. Continue on with the item hunt until James has the final music box, and we can finally go into their old room and unravel the mystery. On a side note, I wish the song that played from the music box puzzle would follow James all the way to room 312 though. It sounds like a legit old school music box would, but it's also kinda creepy at the same time. It fits perfectly for James finally getting to the end of his journey. When we arrive, we don't find Mary waiting for us, but we do get to see the videotape that James and Mary recorded. We don't get anything new at first, just a replay of Mary talking about Silent Hill. As she starts to cough, it cuts to a much darker, harder to see shot of Mary laying in bed with James by her side. He gives her one final kiss and then smothers her with a pillow, killing her with his own hands. Yes, it's heavily foreshadowed that James is an unreliable narrator, but when I was a kid, I never anticipated that James killed Mary himself. He doesn't find Mary waiting for him, but he does find the truth that he was looking for. All that trauma of her illness, the stress that followed, and his smothering of her caused him to blank out the memories as a coping mechanism from all of the PTSD. For any fans of the show Breaking Bad, James is essentially in a real-life fugue state like the one Walt pretends to go through in the beginning of Season 2. James genuinely does not remember killing Mary throughout the game. His role of unreliable narrator is a true one, and he accepts the fact that he committed this action when the truth resurfaces. He doesn't try to hide this or pretend like he never did it. He just sits there staring at the floor and admits to Lara that Mary is dead and that he was the one who killed her. As Lara runs out and it seems like we have our answer to James's mission, Mary's voice carries through the radio and calls out to James that she is indeed still waiting for him. As James leaves the room, the hotel looks just a little more fucked up now. Not in the Silent Hill Otherworld style, but as it is in real life. Dilapidated, rain-soaked, and charred from a fire that happened after James and Mary's vacation. Doors don't lead where they should, and the music is simply an ominous buzzing sound to replicate the disorientation that now has been rushed back into James's head. In a nearby room, we can listen to a conversation James had with Mary's doctor upon learning of her condition. The doctor says that Mary has 3 years at most to live. James's incorrect memories of Mary dying 3 years ago very likely stemmed from this conversation. This was truly the day that everything changed. To James, this was when the Mary he knew and the life he knew both died. With the big twist revealed and the plot wrapping up, we get one last run-in with Angela. She's on a fiery staircase looking at what appears to be a man trapped under something and stitched into the wall. When she first sees James, he appears to her as her mother. While still under this impression, Angela says that Mama's now the only one left. When the camera pans out, we see there's a second figure sewn to the wall on her other side too. We already know that Angela killed her father and fled, but she does have a brother that is only referenced quickly in the game. There is a Silent Hill 2 novel that states Angela also killed him as well. If her mother is the only one left, these two people stitched into the wall could represent her brother and father. Her mother wasn't physically abusive like her father and brother were, but she was emotionally abusive towards Angela and then left the family. It's unknown whether her mother is actually alive or not, but there is something that's kind of chilling to the way Angela says she can rest now that she's found her mother. Is it delusional hope where she feels like her mother can help her? Or is it because she has the intention of finishing off the family and killing her mother for abandoning her? We already saw Eddie completely turn to his murderous side, and despite her timid demeanor, could Angela really have done the same too? It adds such a creepy layer to her story if this whole search for her mother was really a quest to finish killing her whole family before committing suicide herself. We don't really know what Angela's full intentions are here, but either would fit the narrative. We switch to James's perspective as Angela says an upsetting goodbye. We see how little she values herself by saying she wishes James hadn't saved her and she's not even worth the pity. She condescendingly asks if he would truly heal her pain or love her, likely from hearing other men say similar things over the years. Whether this was from men who had good intentions or not, this is more about Angela knowing that nothing anyone could do for her would change her past and her mental state. After James refuses to give her back the knife she planned on killing herself with, she states that her whole world always looks like this fiery staircase. The last little bit of tragedy to end her story is that she's always walking through a living hell. This brings Angela's story to a close, and I don't think I need to get into any more detail about how tragic her character is. It's a real-world subject that is very rarely touched upon in games. Angela has lived through some horrible trauma, but now she's also a mentally unstable, suicidal murderer, and that's how we end her portion of the game. No happy endings to go around here. What better way to forget about that sad character arc than watching Maria die again? This time there are two of Pyramid Head. We now know that the one who's been stalking James all game was there because he killed Mary, and now the second one is there because he killed Eddie. Justified or not, this is James's guilt over taking two human lives. James's dialogue here is a little weird though. He confirms that Pyramid Head was his own manifestation for a subconscious need to be punished. But he also says he only needed Pyramid Head because he was weak, and now it's time to end this. Just because he realizes his transgressions, he did still kinda kill his sick wife. It poses the question to the player, is James guilty or not? Was it really euthanizing her to end an inevitable slow death? Or did he do it for selfish reasons and truly just want to be rid of her and the situation? Anyway, we get what probably should have been the last boss fight of the game. It's nothing different than the other boss fights, but James does manage to finally kill Pyramid Head. Kinda. James has never been able to actually kill this monster. It's only when he accepts his guilt and tries to overcome it that Pyramid Head kills itself. Before we get to the real final boss, we get one more fly-on-the-wall conversation between Mary and James. This is another one that can hit pretty hard. It's a very realistic representation of James trying to be supportive as Mary goes through the gamut of emotions surrounding her illness. Mary verbally attacks him just for bringing her flowers and even mentions how much money her illness is costing the two of them. Her last lines really hit kinda hard. After telling James to get out, she cries by herself while begging James to tell her that she'll be okay and that she won't die. Upon finishing the game, I immediately looked up Mary's voice actress, expecting to see a lot more work. There isn't any. It's weird to me that she never really did anything else. Her roles as Mary and Maria were some of the best voice acting the PlayStation 2 had to offer. While Pyramid Head became such an iconic monster, and in hindsight would have made for the better final boss, from a storyline perspective, it does have a better flow with Maria being the last encounter. It's a nice touch having her appear one last time and in Mary's full attire. It's a quick little mindfuck to fake out the player into thinking the real Mary was here all along. Contrary to what Maria says, it's also a reminder that she's not a real person and is a figment of the town. She's no different than the monsters that James was killing all game, it just took her longer to show it. This is also why I don't particularly like the Born from a Wish scenario. It plays a little too hard on the assumption that Maria is a real person and not just a part of the town. You could argue it's similar to the nurse Lisa Garland's role in the original Silent Hill, but I don't think it fits. Lisa was a real person who got wrapped up in the cult's activities and drugs. At some point she died and was completely unaware of this through the town's magic. Her being alive and in Alessa's memories also helped keep her spirit in Silent Hill. She's essentially forever stuck in the hospital, and once she regained her memories of being Alessa's caretaker, she transformed back into a monster. Maria, on the other hand, is killed repeatedly in-game and turns herself into the final boss after James refuses her. Either way, we've finally made it to the end of the game. Silent Hill 2 is pretty unique in the fact that there is no canon ending. There are 6 endings in total. The UFO and dog endings are joke endings, so those are out. The Rebirth ending, where James tries to revive Mary's corpse, seems like more of a nod to fans that there is still cult activity and witchcraft here in the town. The fact that you can't get this on the first playthrough, and that there's no real hints to James knowing about when or how to use the collected items, shows to me this is more of a fan service ending. That leaves 3 possibilities. I always kinda interpreted the 3 endings as metaphors for heaven, purgatory, and hell. Up first, the Maria ending, or the one I associate with Purgatory. In this ending, the final boss doesn't identify as Maria, but as Mary. Instead of being tricked, James shrugs it off as another manifestation. Once again, it was a monster all along and not the real spirit of Mary. After the boss fight, Maria shows up alive yet again, and James says he's chosen her. He accepts that Mary was never here and has been dead all along. They leave Silent Hill together, but Maria starts to cough, implying that she's suffering the same illness Mary had. An illness that was also foreshadowed earlier when she needs a nap in the hospital. Essentially, this ending puts James in some sort of limbo. We don't know how far Silent Hill's magic can reach, or if Maria can actually leave the town at all. Without having to do any true soul-searching, this ending comes off as James being stuck in stasis, forced to relive his trauma again as he just replaces Mary with Maria. This would kinda make sense too, though. Grading by his bland standards, James acts even more emotionless and flat than the rest of the game. You could argue that this is a canon ending, seeing as it would likely just bring James back to Silent Hill, essentially restarting the events of the game. But it's not a conclusive ending. This would mean he's stuck in a loop until one of the next two endings happens. That leaves us with the last two, called In Water and Leave. I think you'll be able to easily differentiate which of these represents heaven and which represents hell. How you view the strengths of each ending is really all in the eye of the beholder. The In Water ending is just that. James drives his car into Toluca Lake and commits suicide. The Leave ending is also just as it sounds, where James leaves town with Lara. It's definitely the bummer of the two, but I always felt like the In Water ending had more merit to be considered canon. The ending where James finds Lara and leaves Silent Hill to continue his life would almost always be considered the good ending, but it doesn't quite add up here. Firstly, the last time we see Lara in-game, she tells James this.
She died because she was sick?
No. I killed her.
You killer! Why'd you do it? I hate you! I want her back! Give her back to me! I knew it! You didn't care about her! I hate you, James! I hate you! I hate you! I hate you!
She already didn't like James, and the only reason she starts to be nicer is because Mary asked her to in a letter. Lara's a little douchebag to us for most of the game. Remember, she doesn't see Silent Hill like James does. To her, Silent Hill was never dangerous. I don't see how James would have been able to sit Lara down and explain that he killed a couple Pyramid Heads, turned down sex from this kind of monster thing that looked like Mary but was way more of a whore, and that he killed the real Mary with a pillow, but she was gonna die anyway, so fuck it, why wait around for her being indecisive about when it happens? But now he's okay. He sees that what he did was wrong, and he's ready to live a normal life again, pretend all this shit didn't happen, and wants to adopt her. Them leaving through the cemetery isn't just because that's where we start the game either. In the opening cutscene / music video, there's a clip of James carrying Mary's corpse that never made it back into the full game, except for the Rebirth special ending. It's also been confirmed by Masahiro Ito that Mary's corpse is indeed in James's car the whole game, something else that also never made it back into Silent Hill 2's story. If somehow Lara forgave him, I'm pretty sure an 8-year-old girl would change her mind back to nope, fuck this guy, when she sees that he actually had her friend Mary's dead body with him the whole time and starts digging her grave himself. Sometimes a video game is just a game, and there are millions of times you need to suspend your disbelief for a story to come together. But to me, Silent Hill 2 is so heavily reliant on its own story and lore that this kind of happy ending is full of too many plot conveniences. Everything just falls in place all too well. I know that James says he'd never kill himself to Angela, but something about Lara having such a quick turnaround and deciding to befriend James just doesn't sit right with me. Personally, I'm not sold that Lara is a real person either. From what I've read doing my homework for this video, I'm in the minority on this theory, but yeah, I think Lara was a creation of the town to help steer James toward the truth. Through the same opening cutscene, we know that Lara came into Silent Hill with Eddie. We don't know if it's right on the outskirts of town or halfway across the state. Considering Eddie was called to the town as well, Lara could have helped lead Eddie to Silent Hill too. The same opening cutscene shows Eddie fumbling through a map while Lara gets impatient. The most damning evidence, in my opinion, is that James has no clue who Lara is, but she knows who he is right away. Yes, James didn't visit Mary all that often towards the end, but I'm sure at some point during one visit, Mary would have brought up the little girl she wanted to adopt, or the two would have met. There is a counter-argument of Mary's letters to Lara that help dispute this, but think about what happens to James's letter as the game goes on. It fades and eventually disappears. It was never real. What's to say that Mary's note to Lara was any different? I'll cut the Lara theory short, but I just feel like there's much more working against the Leave ending than there is the In Water ending. There are definitely plot holes with the In Water ending as well, though. As I said earlier, James doesn't agree with being suicidal each time Angela brings it up. There's also the whole conversation in both the Leave and In Water endings where the bedridden Mary says James doesn't need to keep suffering, that he needs to go on living his life. But Mary is dead, and once again, this isn't really Mary. This isn't a flashback to before he smothered her. This version of Mary brings up James killing her. They have a conversation about James killing her as if it's in the past. Like every other image of her in this game, this isn't really Mary telling James these things. This wasn't an old conversation. This is an in Silent Hill conversation between James and Mary. It never really happened. Both endings also end with the real letter Mary wrote to him, but I don't think James killing her prematurely was exactly what she had in mind when she was apologizing and saying that he made her happy. To me, In Water wraps up the clues left throughout the story. Lara berating James for being a killer also pushes him further into a suicidal guilt. The fact that the developers have confirmed Mary's corpse being in James's car all along also supports this ending. It's a huge detail to leave out, but a detail that was likely omitted for fear of pushing from a mature ESRB game rating to an adults-only rating, which would have been a financial death wish back then. The few times that we see the real Mary in-game is in the videotape. It's in that tape that she says she always wanted to visit Silent Hill again, and this is how James did it. Him driving all the way to Silent Hill alongside his wife's corpse with the intentions of killing himself would definitely push him further into his emotionally numb persona that we see throughout the whole game. The Lakeview Hotel even turns into a watery set piece right before the end of the game. Masahiro Ito has said that he designed Pyramid Head with the intentions of In Water being the game's ending. Team Silent has remained pretty tight-lipped on what the true ending is, and they'd rather have players decide for themselves. But I don't know. I feel like the game was created with the intention of James's suicide being the canon ending. Something that also would have been hard to ignore when it came time for the ESRB to rate the game. I think the other endings were thrown in as more of a feel-good way to potentially end everything. But this is Silent Hill 2. No one got a reprieve. Eddie dies after embracing his psychotic side. Angela has killed family members and makes it clear she intends on killing herself. Maria is just a Silent Hill monster in disguise that is killed over and over again. Mary was murdered before she died of her own illness and never truly shows up in-game. Lara may or may not be a real person who is a lost, wandering 8-year-old that apparently no one cares is missing. James killed his sick wife and drove to Silent Hill with her corpse in his car. Everything about the story and characters has revolved around tragedy, death, and whether their crimes were justifiable or not. James taking his life fits the tone and the direction of the story much more than him accepting what he did and then going on to live life like nothing ever happened. The whole plot revolves around James remembering that he killed his wife. Yes, it's a bummer, but I wouldn't expect a story like this to have a happy ending. I get why some people wouldn't want to think like that, but for what it's worth, that's my opinion and thought process on the ending of the game. So here we are at the end of an hour-and-a-half long video, and the question is still posed. Is Silent Hill 2 still a great survival horror game? Yes and no. Gameplay-wise, it's nothing special. The gameplay was seen as a weak point in 2001, and it still is in 2021. I hate to say it, there are times that it really doesn't hold up that well. There are people out there that this game just isn't going to be for. Depending on your personal gaming preferences, Silent Hill 2 could easily be seen as boring and clunky. Despite having a full combat system, this game is significantly closer to, say, Layers of Fear than it is to another plot-heavy horror game like The Evil Within. If you don't really care about characters or plot, this isn't for you. However, if you do care about that, the atmosphere and storytelling are still fantastic and definitely make it worth a playthrough even today. I would certainly recommend this game to anyone who enjoys the horror genre as a whole, and anyone who wants to see where the iconic Pyramid Head character comes from. This would also be a great entry point into horror gaming if you're someone that hasn't dabbled into the genre much. Silent Hill 2 can be scary, but it's definitely not as anxiety-inducing or intense as things like Dead Space or the newer Resident Evils. Whether it holds up to today's standards or not, Silent Hill 2 is one of the most important and renowned horror games ever made for a reason. The genre wouldn't be what it is today without this title. So for that alone, I'd say yes, Silent Hill 2 is still one of the best horror games out there, even as it approaches its 20-year anniversary. If you made it through this whole video, seriously, thank you for taking the time, and I do hope you enjoyed it. You guys know all about the like, comment, and subscribe stuff. Do so if you please, it always helps out the channel. I'm pretty sure I said this in my last video, but I am going to try and stop taking so goddamn long to make these things, but life and work get in the way, so we'll see. Hopefully I can stick to that statement this time around. Far and away, my most popular video was my first one on Red Dead 2, and that's a pretty shitty video in hindsight. I've been trying to get better at these, but unfortunately that also makes me take forever, and I do need to find a nice common ground for getting faster when I do get the time to work on a video. Me and my buddy Paul do a podcast called All Things Nonsense that is mostly talking about a mix of video games, movies, and some anime thrown in there too. We've started that back up, and hopefully that stays consistent again too. You can check it out on Spotify, iTunes, and all the other podcast platforms out there if you give a shit about it. Again, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you back. That's all I've got for now. See you guys.